All right, so recently, some of you may have heard in the news that President Trump has announced that he would be importing significant amounts of beef from Argentina. Now, this is supposedly an effort to, one, help decrease the prices of beef in the United States. Prices, as most people have known, have gone up significantly over the last, certainly, 5 years, quite a bit. And the other thing is in an effort to help Argentina. They're a country that he feels would be a good ally and doesn't want perhaps China to have a major influence in that country. So perhaps a win-win for some aspects, but at the same time, our American ranchers are suffering, and we are needing to do something to address that issue as well. So let's talk about some of those things that are going on. Now, one of the major issues that we face is merely a supply and demand issue. This is why prices go up. When supply is low, demand is high, and demand is up. We've seen more and more people, wanting to consume more beef. Part of that has to do with, I think, people understanding that red meat is actually, generally a health food. And, I'll take some credit for that. Don't blame me for the high prices, but that's coming along. And, we have right now historic low numbers of cattle in this country. In fact, the last time we saw numbers this low were in the 1950s. The most we've ever had in the United States was about 130 million head of cattle. That occurred sometime in the mid-1970s. Since that time, we've lost approximately 40 million head of cattle to this point. Today, we're, I think, just under 90 million or somewhere in that range. Additionally, and this is also troubling, a very troubling statistic, back in the 70s, we had something like 1.3, 1.4 million ranchers in the United States. That number has been cut down by nearly 700,000 ranches have gone under since the 1970s. And largely it's due to monopolistic practices, regulations, maybe a loss of interest for some people. But that's a real problem. The fact that we're losing something like 20,000 ranches every single year to bankruptcy, to failure, to people just not wanting to do it anymore is a real problem. And it's really going to harm us long term in this country. Okay, so what are some of the issues that are driving these ranchers to go out of business? Well, in part, some of it has to do with the Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, back in the 1970s saying, go big or go home. And so small ranches had a hard time competing with the economies of scale that these bigger ranches had. And that happens all the time across multiple business fronts. And some people say, well, they just weren't very good businessmen and they deserve to, go out of business. And I think, maybe some of that might be true, but really there are some policies that really make it hard for smaller independent ranchers to succeed. And we really do need a decentralized food supply. The reason for that is, if something happens, and who knows what it is, some sort of, natural disaster or event or something like that, we want our food to come from a broad number of sources, right? And so things like policies that, make it difficult for the ranchers, processing access, this is something that guys like Tom Massey in the Senate are talking about. How do we get better processing facilities? Because, a lot of times, you'll have a ranch and you might have to wait 18 months to get a spot in order to reserve a facility so that you can actually process the animal once it's been slaughtered. That's a real problem. We don't have enough processing access for ranchers, and we need more. We need more at the state level. We need more at the local level. We need to sort of maybe figure out how to make this work alongside the USDA facilities. The other thing that's really important is the fact that we have an issue with land values. Right now farmland is incredibly expensive, and many of these ranches and ranchers are basically asset rich but cash poor. That is to say, they might have hundreds and hundreds of acres valued at millions and millions of dollars, at least on paper, but it doesn't produce very much money because cattle ranching is not a very lucrative, high producing venture generally. Now, so what happens is a lot of times when they pass this land on to their family, a lot of these are multi-generational ranches, and they might want to pass it on to their son or their daughter, and the daughter or son gets an inheritance tax bill that says, you got all this tax to pay on this multi-million-dollar land, and that you don't have the money to pay for. So what do many of them do? Well, they say, well, now I've got to sell part of it. I've got to sell part of it to business development who puts a parking lot on there, or a strip mall, or housing development in that area. So we lose more and more ranch land due to urban sprawl. It's pretty hard to graze cattle in that area again. Some of you guys know about this so-called MCOOL law that's out there. So one of the things that we used to have in place was mandatory country of origin labeling, so that, if you got something in the grocery, you could say, hey, this is a product of Argentina, this is a product of Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, Namibia, Canada, Mexico, wherever it might come from, and these are the major countries that often, import to us. We have some insight, and maybe we want to support our U.S. local ranchers and buy strict product of the USA. Right now, that is deceptive. We have no idea. If you get a hamburger, pound of ground beef, might say product of the USA, but it might have come from Africa, Namibia or something like that. And because the labeling is deceptive, that's a real problem. And I'm not here to suggest that President Trump, by importing Argentinian beef, is going to be bad beef or anything like that. I think Argentinian beef is lauded worldwide as pretty solid quality. Some may prefer it, some may not. And I think just like you might buy French cheese at the grocery store, that may be your preference. And I think we should be open to that. But we also have to realize, while we are, coming to the realization that the beef supply is in jeopardy right now, that we need to either pass legislation or enforce legislation that's been on the books, like the Packers and Stockyard Act from the 1920s, which prevents some of these big corporations from monopolizing the industry. That I know the people that are calling for that's not being enforced. We need to, basically protect our ranchers, and we need to encourage that and make it a financially, successful venture, because food is so important to us. Having good nutrition is essential, and in my view, it's a national security issue. I think we need to have a robust, vigorous food supply to include beef. Beef is incredibly nutritious and very important to this country, and it's one of the reasons we're a great country. We have these, that entire Central Plains district, which supported 100 million buffalo at one point or something like that. So we should take advantage of that. These are some of the issues that are out there. These are very important. I think that hopefully this will elevate this discussion to higher levels so that we can actually get some things done. I talked to a lot of ranchers over the years. I know it's complex. There's a lot of relationships. There's some friction between packers and retailers and ranchers. The ranchers generally seem to get the brunt of the negativity. They have most of the risk. They do most of the work. And they get, in many accounts, the least amount of reward for doing so. Again, as always, support your local ranchers. Buy direct from ranchers when and where you can. It's not to say that supermarket meat is bad or anything like that. I think that's nonsense to talk about that. But we have to figure out collectively how we can support our fellow Americans and our ranchers, these people that sacrifice so much and truly are heroes. These folks that feed us are essential. They are, from the very definition of essential. We don't need more bureaucrats. We're working, certainly, we would be just fine without so many damn bureaucrats. We need more people that actually produce. Anyway, let me know what you guys think.